You're listening to Cornerstone West Los Angeles.
If we haven't met, my name's Scott, one of the pastors here at Cornerstone, and we have been walking through the book of Ecclesiastes. It's an Old Testament book that, for those of you who've been here, I hope that you found it as really just encouraging and freeing in so many ways as I have. And our passage today comes from Ecclesiastes chapter 7. And so we're just going to jump right into it. I'm going to read through our passage, and it'll be up on the screen if you want to follow along, or in the pew Bibles in front of you. So Ecclesiastes chapter 7, starting with verse 13 through the end of the chapter. Consider the work of God. Who can make straight what he has made crooked? In the day of prosperity, be joyful, and in the day of adversity, consider. God has made the one as well as the other, so the man may not find out anything that will be after him. In my vain life I have seen everything. There is a great righteous man who perishes in his righteousness, and there's a wicked man who prolongs his life in his evil doing. Be not overly righteous, and do not make yourself too wise. Why should you destroy yourself? Be not overly wicked, neither be a fool. Why should you die before your time? It's good that you should take hold of this, and from that withhold not your hand. For the one who fears God shall come out from both of them. Wisdom gives strength to the wise man, more than 10 rulers who are in a city. Surely there is not a righteous man on earth who does good and never sins. Do not take to heart all the things that people say, lest you hear your servant cursing you. Your heart knows that many times you yourselves have cursed others. And this I have tested by wisdom. I said, I will be wise, but it was far from me. That which has been is far off and deep, very deep. Who can find it out? I turned my heart to know and to search out and to seek wisdom in the scheme of things, and to know the wickedness of folly and the foolishness that is madness. And I find something more bitter than death, the woman whose heart is snares and nets, and whose hands are fetters. He who pleases God escapes her, but the sinner is taken by her. Behold, that is what I found, says the preacher, while adding one thing to another to find the scheme of things, which my soul has sought repeatedly, and I have not found. One man among 1,000 I found, but a woman among all these I have not found. See, this alone I found, that God made man upright, but they have sought out many schemes. This is the word of the Lord. So you got all that? Right? Seems pretty easy. Right? I think one of the things that's interesting is a passage like this provides us an opportunity to, even before we jump in, ask the question, what do you do when you come across a passage like this? Right? What do you do not only when you come across a passage where you're like, oh, I'm not sure exactly what that part means, but when you hit a verse and you're like, I have no idea what that means, and you get to the next verse and you're like, I don't know what that means, and you get to 2 verses later and you're like, I don't know what that means, right? And it's like they pile up one after another what do you do when you're reading through your Bible and you're like, I don't know. That was the question I was faced with. But really, there's essentially two options, right? We can either prayerfully wrestle with it. We can ask God for eyes to see. We can dig in, turning it over and meditating it. We can read through it, trying to put it in our own words, and we can write down all the questions that come up, the things like, I don't know this, and I don't know this, and I don't know this, and I'm not sure about that. And we can write out our list of questions, and then we can strive to answer those questions and fight to understand. And we can reference study Bibles and talk with our friends and talk with a pastor and wrestle through the different questions we have, struggling until we can stand with confidence and say, Lord, I understand what you're saying here. And then out of what he's saying, seek to apply that and try to figure out what difference that truth makes for us in our lives and how we apply it, what that truth about God means or what that truth about us means. And then we can be transformed as we come to know God through his word more. Or we could give up, right? Which I think is oftentimes what we do when you're reading through a passage like this and you're like, I don't know, what's next, right? We can give up, and we can just move on. This is even actually what a commentator I read this week did. He explained, I was reading through a commentary trying to wrestle through this myself, and one of the commentators explained the first 3 verses, and then he wrote this. The rest of these assorted sayings show how variable is the advice of common sense when it has no unifying principle. And his editor published it. He was basically like, I don't know, look, advice can be really random, can't it? That must be what Ecclesiastes chapter 7 is about. But this, I believe, is not a passage to give up on. Just as I hope you found in our weeks together, Ecclesiastes is not a book to give up on. In fact, I think our passage today takes head on some of life's biggest questions, some of the most fundamental philosophical questions we wrestle with throughout our lives. Because at the very basis, we want to figure out life, right? Don't you want to figure out life? Right? We want to understand why things happen. We want to know why we feel the way we feel. We want to know what the future is going to hold. We want to know how things are going to work out, and we want to know what we need to do in order to make things work out, right? We want to figure out life. But the problem is, we can't. And so we struggle over and over trying to wring out this, almost on this impossible journey. We walk through life with this sense that things aren't the way they're supposed to be, right? I mean, no one's driving to work on Monday thinking, this is paradise, right? How did this happen? This is exactly the way it should be, right? Life, the weekend was perfect, the week ahead's gonna be perfect, and this traffic I'm sitting in is perfect, right? Nobody's, when Monday dawns, or when you walk out the door, even as you're sitting here right now, there's this sense that something's wrong with life. Something's wrong with the world. We're not satisfied, we're discouraged, we're confused, we're tired, and so we try to figure out why, right? We try to put the pieces together, and when we do, I think we often come to one similar conclusion. There's all sorts of different conclusions we come to, but when we ask the question, okay, what's wrong with life? Almost all the answers fall into this broad category called my circumstances, right? What's wrong with life? It's everything that's happening to me. It's my job, or the amount of money I have, or it's my friends, or it's my family, or it's my living situation, or it's the cost of living, or it's a million different things that fall into the category of my circumstances. This is what's wrong with life. And as those who strive to figure out life, it's not enough to know the problem, right? We want to know the problem so that we can fix the problem, right? We want to know what's wrong with life so that we can make the appropriate changes. And so and when we find out, you know what? It seems like what's wrong with life is my circumstances, then I need to figure out what I can do to fix my circumstances, right? How can I change this? I need a new job. Or I need to figure out how to get more money, or I need new friends, or I need to spend less time with my family, or I need to spend more time with my family, or I need to find a new living situation, or I need to go somewhere with a different cost of living, and we spend our lives trying to change and manipulate our circumstances in order to fix what's wrong with life. We try to figure it out, and we try to fix it. We try to figure it out, and we try to fix it. We try to figure it out, and we try to fix it. And we're frustrated. Because we can't. And it's into this cycle we find ourselves in that the preacher speaks. He says, starting in verse 13, consider the work of God. Who can make straight what he has made crooked? In the day of prosperity, be joyful. And in the day of adversity, consider. God has made the one as well as the other so that man may not find out anything that will be after him. See, our desire to figure things out, our attempts to fix them, they never quite work out the way we hope because they're not based in reality. Or they're not based in a realistic understanding of the world and of God. They're based in delusion because we all have this gigantic delusion of control. We want to believe that if we eat the right things and exercise the right way, we can control our physical health. We want to believe that if we make the right financial decisions, we can control whether or not we'll be in need. We believe that if we parent the right way, we can control the way our kids turn out. But the truth is, we don't ultimately control these things. We can't make straight what God has made crooked, or vice versa. Recognizing that we are not ultimately in control is one of the greatest blessings, I think, actually, of the crooked parts of our life. Because, why are we riddled with anxiety? Why are we weighed down with guilt? Why are we deflated by discouragement? And I think it's because we think that we can control more than we can. And since life doesn't look like we'd want it to look, we think that means we've failed. Wait, I was in control and it's not working out. Wait, I was in control and this still keeps happening. And so now, the life not turning out the way we wanted is compounded by the fact that we believe at its core it's our fault because we were in control. But the crooked parts of life, the uncomfortable instances of suffering, the detours we didn't expect, they're not a result of failure on our part. They're a part of God's good and sovereign plan for each one of our lives because ultimately, He is the only one in control. Now, we can have a hard time with this, right? In a lot of different situations, we don't understand why He allows what He allows. We in a lot of different situations, we don't understand what exactly He's doing. In a lot of different situations, we don't understand how what we're experiencing could even be consistent with His love for us. And our time today and in this passage doesn't provide me the opportunity to unpack and solve the problem of evil for you. Right? It's not what I'm going to try to do. And I'm also not going to try to solve the relationship between God's control and His sovereignty and our choices. Those are great things to talk about with your community groups. No, but they are. They're actually great things to wrestle through on your own, in your own heart. I want to encourage you to ask those questions. Ask those questions to the people around you. Ask those questions of your pastors. Like, these are the things we want to wrestle through together. But our passage today looks at all of that and says, yes, these are things we need to wrestle through, but ultimately, there is a lot of mystery in understanding how God controls everything He controls and our ability to even begin to understand it. There's much about His sovereignty, His control over our lives and the entire world that we simply don't understand. God's control over this world, all the ways that He is redeeming its fallenness for our ultimate good, all the ways He's orchestrating it together for His glory, are in large part, and I think actually in the vast majority of the part, a mystery to us. We don't understand most of what He's doing. We don't understand the vast majority of what He's doing. And it's what theologians call His secret will. Paul Tripp puts it pretty simply this way. He says, God's secret will is called His secret will because it's secret. Right? Like you're not supposed to spend your life trying to figure out His secret will, right? That would make it not His secret will. But it's not a secret because God doesn't care about us. It's not a secret because he's trying to withhold something good from us. It's a secret because we can't even comprehend it. Like we just don't even have the capacity, right? It's like trying to explain quantum physics to a 5-year-old, right? If a professor of quantum physics came home to their 5-year-old and their 5-year-old wanted to know about what they were studying, what they were learning, what they were working on, the professor could tell her 5-year-old everything she wanted about quantum physics. She could write out all the math equations. She could draw shapes. She could provide illustrations. She could break out the textbook, and the 5-year-old would understand none of it. Right? Why? Because it doesn't matter how smart the 5-year-old is. It doesn't matter how much Baby Einstein it's watched, how much classical music it's listened to. It does not have the capacity to understand. Now, the professor might provide some basic truths about physics, right? So it's kind of like this, but they will ultimately be superly oversimplified. and they will be something basic that the 5-year-old can comprehend. See, the problem is, though, you and I think a little bit more highly of ourselves than that. Right? We're like, whoa, 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 that's true, but I am not a 5-year-old. Right? I am a smart human being. Right? I am educated. Like I know some stuff, which is funny because that's actually probably what the 5-year-old would say. And to the extent that the 5-year-old thinks they understand it, they're wrong, right? To the extent that they're like, oh, I get it. I totally understand it now. You're like, okay. Right? But we are like the 5-year-old. I mean, I think we think a little bit too highly of ourselves because the distance between a 5-year-old and a professor of quantum physics is not larger than the difference between the professor of quantum physics and God. Right? The space between the capacity difference between a 5-year-old and the smartest adult in this room is still tiny compared to the difference between the smartest person in this room and God. We're not like getting close. We're not like almost there, right? We are like increasing on tiny little levels because the vast majority of God and His will and the way in which He works and who He is simply beyond our capacity to even begin to comprehend. This is why the preacher says God has made the one as well as the other so the man may not find out anything that will be after him. There is much of it that we simply can't understand. But it doesn't stop us from trying, does it? Right? It doesn't stop us from trying. We're like, no, but maybe I can. Right? Maybe I can kind of figure this out. Because our internal bent is want to understand Him, to want to take His place, really. Because our desire is to have more control than we do, more knowledge than we do, because we think we know best. We think we have a better plan than the one God's working out. We're like, you know what? I'm looking at everything, I'm putting the pieces together, and I think this could work better differently. Right? I think this could work out if you just took a couple of my suggestions. And this is actually, I think sometimes we're like, well, wait, no. I know not to try to replace God. He's God. I shouldn't try to replace Him. I'm just going to offer some suggestions. Maybe He'll take them, right? Maybe I can figure out a way to manipulate this life, to manipulate the system, to have it turn out according to my plan. But see, if this passage teaches us that God is sovereign over all of life, it also teaches us that life is not a system to be manipulated. Life is not a system to be manipulated. He goes on in verse 15. He says, in my vain life I have seen everything. There is a righteous man who perishes in his righteousness, and there is a wicked man who prolongs his life in his evil doing. This is essentially an anti-proverb. Right? I mean, like literally, Proverbs 11, verse 8 says, the righteous is delivered from trouble, and the wicked walks into it instead. With his mouth, the godless man would destroy his neighbor, but by knowledge, the righteous is delivered. And here Solomon says, but also, I've also seen the righteous man who perished in his righteousness, and I also saw the wicked man who prolonged his life in wickedness. So, yes, that's the way it normally works, but not always. And so the Proverbs essentially teach us what life is generally like. But here he reminds us that understanding what life is generally like doesn't mean that life is a system we can manipulate to our advantage. Knowing what life is generally like doesn't mean that you can guarantee outcomes, that you can control things by doing the right thing, by saying the right thing, by taking the right steps. The universe is not a predictable machine to be mastered. It's not a system to be manipulated. I think too often we embrace righteousness and wisdom. Even as Christians, we can embrace righteousness and wisdom, not out of a passionate love for God, not I am so captivated by who you are, I am so in love with you, I just want to do whatever, I want to follow you, I want to become like you, I want to do whatever you want me to do. We don't pursue righteousness like that. We pursue righteousness like, you know what? This seems to work out for me. Monogamy, seems to be good. You told me to not commit adultery. You know what? Life seems easier that way. It's probably better for me financially. It's probably better for my joy. It's probably better for my kids. It works. This righteousness can deliver me what I want. Right? So can this wisdom. Hey, you know what? Being smarter about this, not lying at work, not cheating. You know what? These things, it makes some things harder, but overall, it seems to deliver what I want. So I am going to try to be more righteous, and I'm going to try to be more wise, because maybe that is the way I can work the system and get what I want. I can get what I want out of life by being righteous and by being wise. Which is why he goes on in verse 16 and says, be not overly righteous. And do not make yourself too wise. Why should you destroy yourself? Isn't that an interesting encouragement? Right? Like, what's he referring to? Well, the preacher here, he isn't talking about a God-fearing, God-centered righteousness. He's talking about righteousness for righteousness' sake. He's talking about a deep self-righteousness. He's talking about the righteousness of the Pharisees. He's talking about the way that we pursue righteousness because we love righteousness, not because we love God. He's talking about how we pursue righteousness for its good in our lives, not because we love God. This is what happens when we assume we know what God wants in every situation, so we no longer need to seek his will. We no longer need to listen to him. We no longer need to pray and ask for wisdom. Instead, we're off on a journey on ourselves. We're just trying to figure out the most efficient, the most effective way to pursue righteousness. And so we add rules to rules, right? We make even bigger and broader rules to maintain and to secure and make sure that our righteousness is maintained, because righteousness becomes the way we think we will be delivered. Maybe it comes in the form of an obsession with efficiency. Right? Because we believe that increased efficiency, if I can be this righteous today, that means if I can be more efficient tomorrow, I can be more efficient, I can be more righteous. Or maybe it comes in the form of equating our political beliefs with wisdom. We never revisit or question them. We never ask, God, what do you want? We think, you know what? This seems to work out best for me. Maybe it comes in the form of a judgmental heart that feels superior to those around us who don't match our righteousness. And instead of feeling compassionate, longing to help others change, we think, you know what, maybe I should teach you to be more like this, because this is how it works out. And while for some, this dependence on righteousness or wisdom are their ultimate life hack, others try to get the most out of life by simply indulging in foolishness. This is why he goes on in verse 17, says, it is good that you should take hold of this. Right before that. Why should you destroy yourself? Be not overly wicked, neither be a fool. Why should you die before your time? It's good that you should take hold of this, and from that withhold not your hand, for the one who fears God shall come out of both of them. Since life can't be manipulated by following the rules closely enough, sometimes we're like, okay, well, if it can't be manipulated by following the rules closely enough, then I should just do whatever's fun, right? If I can't get the most out of life that way, then I'm just going to try to get the most out of life through whatever seems to make sense to me. So you lie at work. Just the little ones, right? Or you indulge in porn, or you cheat on your spouse, or you get drunk, or you shirk your responsibilities for whatever is fun. The preacher is trying to help us see that neither of these different paths actually deliver you on anything lasting for life. But he's not trying to carve out a moderate middle here, right? It's not like, don't be too righteous, don't be too foolish, just be like a little righteous and a little foolish, and life will work out. Isn't that like that? That is like that's the way our world works right now, right? A little bit of righteousness, a little bit of foolishness, and everything in moderation, and life works out. But he's not saying don't be too righteous and don't be too foolish. He's not saying don't find somewhere in the middle. He's saying, need this whole system of trying to find something that can work out for you. He says it's completely bankrupt. It's not that you need a better system. It's that you need to follow God. Because you need to put away your systems, trying to work systems through righteousness, try to working it through foolishness. So no, you need to put away your systems and be captivated by God. Because it's good that you should take hold of this, and it's good that you should withhold not this from your hand, for the one who fears God shall come out from both of them. Fearing God, respecting and honoring God, loving God, and pursuing Him more and more is the path forward He's calling us on. To not pursue righteousness for righteousness' sake, but to live righteously out of a heart that is captivated by God and wants to follow Him. To not pursue wickedness or foolishness out of a quest for joy or fulfillment, but to look to God because you know He's the only place where you can find ultimate joy and fulfillment. And to not pursue wisdom as something we can gain and something we can possess, something we can work in our world to our advantage, but to see wisdom simply as a gift from God. Just as some insight He's given to us in this world that shines a little bit of light into our dark world and shows us the way forward. This is what the preacher goes on to talk a little bit more about. He talks about wisdom and how it can provide, what it can provide in the midst of life. I think when we think about righteousness and when we think about wisdom, if wisdom can't give us the keys to the system, then we're like, well, then what good is it? Right? Why pursue wisdom if it can't deliver me control? He says, look, it can't deliver control, but that doesn't mean it's no good. It has its purpose. He goes on in verse 19. It says, wisdom gives strength to the wise man more than 10 rulers who are in a city. Surely there's not a righteous man on earth who does good and never sins. Do not take to heart all the things that people say, lest you hear your servant cursing. Your heart knows that many times you yourself have cursed others. All this I have tested by wisdom. I said, I will be wise, but it was far from me. That which has been is far off and deep, very deep. Who can find it? He says, if we really, really want to figure out life, but we can't, what good is wisdom? Right? If wisdom can't provide control, what's it for? Well, the biblical answer, both here and elsewhere, is that wisdom illuminates the darkness of life so that we can see things a bit more clearly and find our way forward. It's something that helps us see ourselves accurately, like in verse 20, or relate to others helpfully, or recognizing just the reality and depth of the mystery. Think of wisdom. Wisdom is kind of like think of it like a candle in a dark cave. I mean, have you ever been in just like a completely dark cave? We were in a cave in the Sequoias a couple of years ago, and our tour guide kind of takes us into a chamber, and then you go through another passageway and kind of into a chamber, and kind of into another passageway into a chamber, and so you're like deep into this mountain, and so you're like rooms and rooms away from any light, and it's at that point that he has everybody turn their flashlights off, right? And when everyone turns their flashlight, I mean, when like the last person finally turns their flashlight, because there's always the guy who's like, no, it's the button, just the button. And then he's like trying to like cover it up, right? But in darkness, like a little bit of light gets out and it ruins the whole like thing, right? Finally, the guy turns his light off, and it's pitch black. And what's fascinating is it is immediately disorienting, right? All of a sudden, like you knew there was a wall 5 feet away. Now you don't know it's there anymore. Right? Like it's like you kind of remember it being there, but now you don't know. And the person, like you start grappling to hold someone's hand because you know they're standing right next to you, but you don't know. Because you can't see anything. And in that type of pitch black, it makes you like almost immediately, if you're not holding on to anybody, it makes you dizzy. Because your eyes are so used to receiving information that they don't know what to do with the confusion of nothing. And so you don't even know where you're like, I think I'm standing up straight, but I might be leaning about to fall over. Like I can't tell, right? It's just like you get dizzy and it's completely disorienting. And I think that type of darkness is what life without wisdom is like. It's why people live most of life just like grappling around, trying to grab onto something, trying to, crawling because they're afraid because they don't know where to step. They don't know what's safe. They don't know what's out there. Having wisdom is like having a candle in the darkness. All of a sudden, things are lit up. All of a sudden, you can see the outline of the closest wall. Now, it's not perfect sight because the candle flickers, and so the shadows go in and out. And it doesn't illuminate everything, right? I mean, you can see a lot, but there's still much that's beyond the reach of the candle's light. There's still much that is beyond, that exists in the darkness, but the candle gives you enough light to take a safe step. It gives you enough light to know where to go, and it gives you enough light to know where not to go. This is wisdom. As Ian Provon, a commentator, writes, he writes, the Bible has not given to the church, the Bible has not been given to the church so that we can control the times. It's given only so that we may have sufficient light to love by, as we worship the God of mystery and wonder. Wisdom has been given to us so that we have enough light to love by. Not so that we can figure it all out, not so that we can understand it all, but simply so that we have enough light to love by as we worship the God of mystery and wonder. Because God is a God of mystery and wonder. Does that inspire your worship? Did you stand in awe of God's mystery, of the darkness beyond what you can see, of the vastness that you cannot comprehend? Or does it frustrate you? See, when the mystery of God and the wonder of his secret will frustrates us, it's because we're striving to live in a world that has us at the center, not him. But to the extent that we are living in God's world, with God at the center, we recognize that his mystery as beautiful and awe-inspiring. Right? I mean, if the cave were small enough to be fully illuminated by a candle, it'd be nice, but it wouldn't be impressive. Right? It'd be like, okay, this is cool. Like, it's all right here. Okay, seen it all. But the fact that the cave that is so deep, so vast, so gigantic that you can be like, oh my gosh, I bet this cave goes back a mile. And you take your candle and you hike a mile, and you're not even close to it. All there is beyond it is darkness. You're like, oh my gosh, this cave must be 10 miles. And the more you discover, the more you realize of the mystery and the wonder, ultimately, that is God. See, the thing about the knowledge of God, it's like that. The more we come to know, the more we come to know about him, the more we come to know him personally, the more we comprehend his beauty and glory, the more we realize we don't know. We realize that he is in fact more glorious, more gracious, more beautiful, more mysterious than we ever imagined. This is why the preacher writes, all this I have tested by wisdom, and I said I will be wise. But now, having gained all this wisdom, he says, I say, it's far from me. That which has been is far off and deep, very deep. Who can find it out? John Calvin, and actually Augustine before him, call this learned ignorance. Learned ignorance. It's the reality that the more spiritually mature we become, the more we know about God, the more we understand of his greatness and his beauty, the more ignorant we realize we are. And that actually, when we think we know God the most, when we think we've understood him the most completely, it's actually a sign of immaturity. Because the reality of him, his mystery, is greater than anything we've ever imagined. As Philip Ryken explains, he says, knowing the limits of wisdom is a part of wisdom. The more we know, the more we should realize how little we know, and that whatever wisdom we gain simply comes as a gift from God. Calvin writes about this. He says, let us not be ashamed to be ignorant of something in this matter. Essentially, he says, don't let us not be ashamed of ignorance in this matter, because there is, and actually he then goes on to warn against trying to figure out things beyond that which we can understand. He says, actually, it's foolishness to understand. And this is what the preacher is coming up against here, right? He essentially says, I searched out wisdom, and I found out I have less than I thought. It's deep. It's very deep. Who can search it out? The mystery is beyond. We really, really want to figure life out. We want to make sense of it. We want the light of day in the cave. But God knows our eyes weren't even created to see that way. Daylight in the cave would blind us. We wouldn't even know what to do with it. We wouldn't even have the capacity to process it. But God, as he so often does, responds to our request to understand life, not by pulling back the curtain on the mysteries of the universe, but instead helping us to understand ourselves. See, in the midst of this world, we all want a window, right? We're like, just give me a window. Give me a glimpse out there to the way it works, so I can understand how things are going here. And every time we look for a window, we go to the wall and we start groping around looking for a window, he puts in front of our face not a window, but a mirror. He says, if you want to understand what you need to understand more, you don't need a window. You need a mirror. What you need to know and what you need to understand, it's not out there. It's in here. It's about us. Which leads us to the last section of our passage, where in verse 25, the preacher goes on, he says, I turned my heart to know and to search out and to seek wisdom and the scheme of things and to know the wickedness of folly and the foolishness that is madness. And I find something more bitter than death. The woman whose heart is snares and nets and whose hands are fetters. He who pleases God escapes her, but the sinner is taken by her. Behold, this is what I found, says the preacher, while adding one thing to another to find the schemes of things which my soul has sought repeatedly, but I have not found. One man among 1,000 I have found, but a woman among all these I have not found. See, this alone I found, that God made man upright, but they have sought out many schemes. We ask these questions. I want to figure out life. I want to know what's wrong with the world. What's wrong with life? And as G.K. Chesterton, right, he famously, there was a question put out in the London Times, I think it was the London Times, so, asking the readers to submit their theories on what's wrong with the world. And he wrote back a simple 2-word reply. He said, Dear sirs, I am G.K. Chesterton. He says, I know at the core, he says, what's wrong with life, it's not about what's wrong. The reason we don't have contentment and joy, the reason we fight, and the reason we struggle so, he says, fundamentally, the most fundamental problems in life aren't out there. They're in here. And there's a couple of words in this section that in order to grasp this, we need to take a closer look at. The first is this word schemes. He mentions it multiple times, these schemes that he's trying to understand. Now, I don't know about you, but when I hear the word schemes, I think of like a villain in his lair, right? What shall be my scheme, right? Like I'm pretty sure, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that's not what was in the preacher's mind when he was writing this. Right? When he says schemes here, he's not talking about some villain in his lair. It's not like, oh, everyone is hatching their schemes. When he talks about schemes, he's talking about the overarching plan for the world. Essentially, the way the world is set up. Right? There's this overarching plan, the way the world is set up. He says, and I sought to figure out the scheme, the overarching plan of the world. He says, but each one of us comes up with our own individual schemes, the ways we want life to turn out, our plan for the world. And so when he looked inside at people, what he found was dark and pretty confusing. He found scheming. He found these plans that really were all me-centered and that people kept falling into. He found the propensity for people to trap one another and to use one another. This is what he's talking about this woman whose heart's as snares and nets, right? That's just one example of the ways that people get trapped, the ways that people get snared by one another, the ways that people set traps for one another, right? He says, look, people are just setting traps everywhere, and everywhere people are falling into those traps. It's only because they're in the dark, right? Without wisdom, you don't even know where to step. And he says, in these schemes, these plans and these traps, he says, they produce things that are even worse than death. He says, even death hurts, but the fallenness of humans on earth leads us into situations, traps, and being trapped that are darker, more painful, and even more bitter than death. Because what's wrong with life? What's wrong with the world? So we are. It's dark. But the second word he uses over and over, in addition to schemes, he uses this word found. I think we need to understand this word found. When he says, he's not like looking for something that's lost and he's like, oh, found it. But when he uses the word found, he's using it to convey our ability to learn, our ability to comprehend. Essentially, I think the phrase I've been using is figure things out. Right? He's like, I figured it out. I've comprehended it. I've understood it. I've been able to put the pieces together. And so if we look at verse 27, he's essentially saying this. He says, behold, this is what I figured out, says the preacher, while adding one thing to another to find the overarching plan of things. Right? He's like, I'm trying to find the overarching plan of things, and I was adding one thing to another, and this is what I figured out. He says, which my soul has sought repeatedly, but I have not figured out. One man among 1,000. He says, so not only have I looked out and not been able to figure out, he says, then I looked in and in at people. He says, one man among 1,000 have I figured out, but a woman among all these I have not figured out. He's tried to put all his observations together, and he still can't figure it out, but neither has he been able to figure out the mystery of people. I think essentially what he's saying here is I tried to figure out, I looked at 1,000 men, and I only figured out one. I actually think he's probably talking about himself. Right? He's like, okay, look, I'm a man. I kind of understand what's going on in here, but there's no one else I could figure out. And you know what? I'm not a woman, and so I looked at 1,000 women. I couldn't figure that out either. Like, I looked at 2,000 people. And the only one I have any insight into is what's going on in my own heart. But I couldn't figure out any of them. The final verse in our passage provides this capstone, really the conclusion in the midst of it all. The conclusion of his insight here. He says, see, this alone I figured out, that God made man upright, but they have sought out many overarching plans. This is the one thing I know, he's saying. Humans are sinful, they're idolatrous, they're self-worshiping beings. But they weren't created that way. His language transports us back to Genesis 1. Right? Back to Genesis 1, 2, and 3, where God created the world and it was perfect. It was all very good. He created Adam and Eve and put them in the Garden of Eden. And he created them in his image as perfect reflections of him. They were human. So they didn't have the capacity to understand all the mysteries of the world. But God gave them a candle and he promised to work with them, or to walk with them. But one of the things they could clearly see with that candle was that they had an entire cave to explore. Right? They couldn't see everything. They didn't know everything of the grandeur of God, but they knew enough. They'd been given enough through the light of the candle to know where to step and to know where not to step. And they heard God's overarching plan, and they said, okay, I hear your plan, and as a part of your plan, this tree isn't somewhere we should step. But I'm not sure I like that plan. Right? In fact, Eve said, Adam said, I think I have a better overarching plan. I think I have a better way to do this so that they might be like God. And so they said, you know what, I'm going to implement a different plan and see how this works out. And ever since, we've been looking at God's plan, looking at his way and saying, wait, but I can't know everything, so I'm not sure your plan is trustworthy. So I'm going to try to put in place my plan. But just like God has gave Adam and Eve everything they needed to know, he's also given us everything we need as well. The problem, though, is we continue to seek out our many different overarching plans. And so we try to use our wisdom to get what we want. We try to use our righteousness to get what we want. We try to use and engage in foolishness to get what we want. We've devised all sorts of different schemes to trap others to get what we want. We've used others to get what we want. But the problem is far deeper than just saying that we have the wrong system. It's not just like, oh, I have the wrong system. I need a better system. I need more righteousness. I need more wisdom. The problem is we're trying to be God. And this is what the Bible calls sin. Trying to do things on our own terms. Trying to set our own rules and manage our own systems. When we spend life scrambling around looking for a window, it's because we want to figure out life and we want to know how to fix it. We want to figure out the glitch in the system out there and do something about it. But God holds up a mirror and says, look, the most significant thing that's wrong with life, it's not out there, it's in here, it's sin. It's your attempts to be like God. It's your attempts to not want to follow him, but want to implement your own overarching plan. It's your desire even to understand his plan that's secret and mysterious and in large part unknown. And our lack of joy, our lack of contentment, our lack of peace and self-control and love and compassion and fulfillment, our lack of all the good that God has to offer isn't because we haven't found the right system. It's because we're still trying to figure life out. It's because we're still trying to implement our own overarching plans. It's because we're still trying to be God. But when we recognize who we are, and we confess our fallenness, and we confess our sinfulness, and we confess our weakness, and we confess really our humanity, God meets us in our humility, as he has most ultimately met us in our humility by sending his Son. Right? The plan to send Jesus, for God to become a man and die for the sins of the world, that was in the darkness to Solomon's candle. That was a part of the mystery. And thanks be to God that God didn't go, you know what, maybe I should listen to Solomon instead of going forward with my plan. Right? God knew. Solomon didn't know. It was a mystery. It was way in the darkness. Who could find it out? But God knew he had a plan in place to bring all things and to redeem all things through his Son, which he has done, and which we now, the candles that we get to hold, we get to see that. We get to see Christ. We get to see his forgiveness and his grace. We get to see that on the cross, he died and paid the penalty we deserve to pay for this rebellion, for this sin, and so that we can be forgiven, so that we can be adopted, so that we can be redeemed. We can see that. But there's still lots we can't see. But he says, I've given you enough. And so, in light of all of this, in light of what God's done, in light of our limited view, in light of the candle that we hold and the darkness beyond it, guys, we can take a deep breath. We can rest. You don't have to figure out life. You don't have to work the system. It won't even work when you try. You can rest that he is perfectly sovereign. He is in complete control. And he is completely good. And he sent his son to demonstrate it and show it and to approve it. And he loves you. And so we can rest, and instead of trying to figure out life, trying to figure out how it's going to work, we can simply rest and say, okay, Lord, I don't need to know it all. I don't need to figure it out. What do you want me to know? And in his word, through his body, empowered by his Spirit, that we have. Let me pray. Heavenly Father, it is so overwhelming and peaceful and beautiful to be loved by you, to be known by you, and to know who you are and that you're in control. God, we confess to you this morning our fallenness. We confess to you our sinfulness. We confess to you our humanity. Lord, there's much we can't know. And we thank you for it, Lord. Thank you for sending Christ for that which we can know, so that we can be redeemed and reconciled to you and follow you every step of the way. We praise you, Lord, for the opportunity to together remember that sacrifice and be reminded again that your plan, your overarching plan is perfect. We're humbled to even get to be a part of it. We thank you, and it's in Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Thank you for listening to Cornerstone West Los Angeles. For more information, please visit us on the web at cornerstonewla.org.